let's kick things off here. My name is Ann Parmeter, and I am working with Focus and bringing in guests who our community would like to hear from on topics of productivity and time management. In a recent session, we asked people what they wanted to hear about. And one thing people wanted to hear about was actually saying no and setting boundaries around their work. You may have joined us a couple of weeks ago. We had a session on burnout, which was so relevant for this time that we're going through, where people are working from home, they're having a really difficult time with extending work hours and demands. So I reached out to Genny to speak with us about this topic of setting boundaries and saying no. I have attended some of Genny's workshops and they are an absolute blast. So I wanted her to come and speak with us today on this topic. So Genny, why don't you tell us, introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I have a small business called the EQ School, where, as Ann said, I teach workshops on developing emotional intelligence. And some of the topics that we talk about are around developing self-awareness, emotional self-management, so understanding our emotions and understanding how to meet our emotional needs, and then also relationship management. So I do a lot of work around how to give and receive feedback, how to approach conflict, and definitely about how to set and hold boundaries. So that is what we're going to be talking about today.
Awesome. So I wanted to kick things off, Genny, and ask you, how can we set boundaries in our professional relationships right at the outset?
Well, we're just going to go ahead and get right into it, right? And start talking about when it comes to learning how to say no and when it comes to learning how to set boundaries. A lot of the time when people talk about boundaries, we think of them as like setting that line in the sand of like, this is the no, this is where you can't go any further. Like, this is how I tell you how to stay out. But in reality, boundaries are actually, they're a container for our needs and our wants and the things that we need in order to be our best selves and to show up and do our best work. And so if we think of it just from like how to tell people no, it's not going to go super well. We need to think of it from like, what do we actually want to say yes to? So boundaries help us let other people know what we need, and they help us continue to reprioritize and think about like, what are my needs and what am I needing and how do I keep that met, keep those needs met. So if you struggle with saying no, you have to start identifying what it is that I want to say yes to. And then it actually makes it a lot easier, because it's not then that I'm just saying no to you, I'm actually saying yes to something that makes sense. And I think that shift can be really, really helpful for many of us, especially if we feel like we struggle with people pleasing and we struggle with like letting other people down. It's like, think about what's most important. And so to do that, it's really important that we spend some time identifying what our needs are, what our values are. So what are the things that drive us? What are the things that motivate us and make us happy? What are the things that like really keep us going? Because when we start holding space for those things, it helps us develop confidence around like, oh no, I do know that this is what I need. So I need to make sure that I'm holding space for it. And we also need to start paying attention to like what our triggers are, where are the spaces where like, when something happens, it knocks us off the rails and we know that like this doesn't go well. So we can pay attention, so we can start to see when some of those behaviors might start to crop up. So an example might be like, well, for me, a personal example is like, I know I don't do super well with like authoritative leadership styles. And so my own personal boundary is like, I probably won't go into the US military anytime soon, or I won't work in environments where like that is the culture. So that's a personal boundary that I know and I have with myself based on like, that would trigger me. I would push back against that. And then my focus wouldn't be on the things that I would want to be achieving. So paying attention to where are our sensitive areas and how do we hold space for them? And then also what are the things we really care about that we want to make sure to hold space for?
So we think,
oh, go ahead.
Oh, can we think on it? What's like a concrete example on that last slide of something that you're saying yes to? Can we put this in, like frame this up with an example?
Yeah, well, I mean, even if you're like, I know I want to be spending more time with my family, or like, I know, I mean, if we're thinking about, we're start with personal examples, which I think the personal is the professional. We should be bringing more of ourselves. There is not a separation between those two things. If you truly want to do good work, like you should be bringing your whole self to it.
Yeah.
So I think like, but when I think of projects and thinking about like, you know, if I really want to make sure that I hit a certain deadline, I have to make sure to prioritize, like, this is my need, this is important to me. So I have to know that I'm saying yes to these certain things that I want to achieve. I have to say no to all the other interesting, fun, like shiny stuff that comes up in the meanwhile until I finish that. So knowing that,
Yeah.
like, what is my priority here and making sure that I focus on that.
Yeah. And I had heard of this in terms of time management, in talking with your manager. Like, I'm just assuming that your manager is putting something on your plate and you cannot do it. Instead of even having to say no, you do define what you are saying yes to. So you can say, hey, I'm working currently on XYZ, and I'll be able to do that starting June 15th. So at no point are you saying, I refuse to do this. You're saying this is what I can do.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny, I was talking to a friend yesterday who has a client who keeps pushing boundaries on things. And we were talking about like, how do you hold that space? And that it's really helpful and important to be able to take their words sometimes and understand like, what is their overall goal? And then figure out how to say like, here's how I can help you meet your goal by staying within these parameters. Because if we go outside of these parameters, then your goal isn't going to be met, and the team's goal, or whatever their company's goal isn't going to be met. So when you can tie it back to when we know what these things are at the outset, like what are we actually trying to achieve? What do we want to get out of this? We can keep circling back to that and kind of keep it as our guiding compass. Which again is less of I'm saying no and more of like, oh, we're just steering in the right path that we want to be going down.
Yep.
Makes sense?
Awesome.
And so professionally, in terms of things that we can think about, so right on this path, the same path, is thinking about our goals for ourselves professionally, our goals for the project, and then prioritizing those things. Like actually, and it's so important to take the time to really sit down and think through this. I can't stress this enough that I feel like so many people just feel like they know, or like, okay, yeah, I kind of got that. But actually sitting down and going through what is the priority here. And especially if you're working on a team or working with other people, making sure that we're both on the same page with this. Because then it's so easy that when we get off track to point back and be like, remember we agreed to this? It's so much easier than, having like I don't know, feeling like you're pushing back or saying no, but it's like, let's bring it back to what we talked about already, right? Is a much easier way to approach that. And so part of that is like envisioning what do I want the outcome to actually look like? I think in both personal and professional lives, it's important to think about this, because then it's easier to see like when we're not going that way. You can kind of like, if we describe what does success look like in this project, what does success look like at the end of the year, on this project, or like in my career, we can start to see when we're veering away from that and what we're like getting away from. So it can help us again, say no to the things that keep us on that path. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And so I also wanted to talk about when we do have to say no, or when we do have to set a boundary. I wanted to talk about a little framework called nonviolent communication. So is anyone familiar with this one?
Yes, a little bit, but not enough.
So it was developed by a guy named Marshall Rosenberg, and it's really incredibly so helpful in conflict, especially when we have big feelings and it's hard to communicate. So oftentimes, especially when we struggle with people pleasing, it can be really hard. If you feel like you're going to be in trouble or whatever, oftentimes when our emotions go up, our intelligence goes down. We don't feel like we have the right words for it. So this kind of framework can be really helpful. And so all it is it's breaking down whatever we're trying to communicate into the behavior that isn't working, the feeling, which would be like how it impacts you, the feeling you're having as a result from it. And then we shift it into like, what is the need? Like, what do I want the outcome to be? And so in personal examples, the example that I love to give is like, if I'm hanging out with my sister and she's kicking the table and it's like really annoying me, like you know, as a kid, I might've been like, oh, you're so annoying, knock it off. But if you were to use this framework, it would be, hey, when you kick the table, you know, like I'm feeling really frustrated. I feel kind of anxious when you do that. Can you please stop kicking the table? So it's so much more clear. It takes the pressure off the person to change, and it puts on a specific behavior, which is changeable. People aren't, behaviors are. And then it lets them know the impact that it's having on you. And then you give them a specific, like, here's the need that I have. And so I feel like this framework can be used in all kinds of different ways. And I have found it to be incredibly helpful. I've done a lot of work in tutoring writing, and I use it a lot for pointing out, like, oh, well, this sentence has this effect on the overall piece. So it might be helpful if you try doing it this way. And so this can be really helpful with setting boundaries, to name, like, well, this behavior, if we were to go and do this thing, it would then have this impact on the project, or it would have this impact on, like, the total hours that I have available to you. So, you know, then it would take away from the project. So my request would be that maybe we don't do that and we stay with this, because then that's going to actually help us, again, come back to whatever the goal, the overall goal is.
So can I add something here? When I first learned about nonviolent communication, it took me a moment to realize that this model is getting us away from associating a person with their behavior. And
Mhm.
that what we want to avoid is saying, like, you do these things, like, you're bugging me, or you're, you know, making these demands. And instead, like, this behavior, because then we can step away from it and view it as separate from ourselves.
Yeah, and it helps the other side to be a lot less defensive, because it's not like, it's not you, it's, yeah, behavior is changeable. Typically, like, who we inherently feel we are is not. So when we can name a specific behavior, it can help. And so that's why I also think with saying no, or with holding boundaries within the workspace, it's not saying, like, oh, you are just wanting so much of my time. You know, it's like, hey, oh, okay, well, if we were to change in this regard, here's the impact that it would have. You can take it one step further and say, like, and that would feel really stressful for me. I don't think I would be able to deliver. So I would recommend that we do this, and here's how that, and I think what I would add to this too is, like, here's how that would impact the project.
Yep.
I think,
And that's
tying it back to them and how it benefits both of us is also incredibly helpful.
And that doesn't feel like yucky or scary to say, like, oh, and this is how it would impact the project. Like, that doesn't feel like it's infringing on anyone's personal values.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I know, I'm curious if anyone who's watching has any questions about that. Because I know it can be a little tricky at the outset.
Or even a way that something that they're needing to say no to right now. Does anyone have a workplace example of something that they're struggling with saying no to? Ooh, Greg Lewis has an example. Let's hear it. How can we, Duncan, can you unmute Greg? I was hoping that Greg was going to share an example.
Oh, cool.
There
I
we
can
go.
talk now. Hey, everybody. I think I shared this a little bit over the weekend with you, Anne, but recently I'm working with a new director who I like and I'm engaging with, and I feel like it's reciprocal, and he'd like me to take on more responsibility, some of which I don't really fit with my job description. And the new term that I've heard is it's non-promotable activity. It's basically like, hey, can you help me organize these meetings? And I don't really feel like it fits. And I don't know if it's something I want to be able to say constructively no to, or at least have a constructive conversation with. And so it's less maybe a nonviolent community. I mean, obviously it's nonviolent communication, but how do we communicate that?
Well, I've talked with you a little bit about job stuff too, Greg.
Yes.
And I think it doesn't have to be, we initially want to go to, like, well, that's not my job. But what you can do is you come back to, like, well, what is my job? What am I responsible for? And like, how is that filling up my time? And how is that contributing to whatever we're trying to accomplish? And focusing more on like, I would really rather focus my energy here. And I know that if I take on something else, you know, I probably won't be able to put in the appropriate time and energy to these things that I'm already doing. Could be a different way to kind of approach that, which isn't like, ugh, that's not my job, but it's like, well, the things that I am doing are taking up a lot of time and energy, and I'm feeling really good about them. And I need that, you know, that space to continue to do that.
It's like
And here's how it would
kind of bringing
impact.
them in on this values conversation.
Mm-hmm. Say that again.
Kind of just bringing them in on the current state and values, and
Yeah. Well, and because like, what is the feeling that comes up for you when they ask that of you?
It's great. I feel uncomfortable because it's not, and this, I guess, gets you in touch with it, right? Or me in touch with it, because it's not part of my value set. It's a responsibility that's more tactical and administrative than the strategic nature of my job. And it would take up a lot more bandwidth of a very tight priority list that I already have.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's making me think of
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh yeah, and I like what Nick shared. Is this task more important than this other work right now?
Absolutely. And I think like the whole kind of thing that we're talking about is when we shift the focus to what we're actually trying to achieve and what we actually want to be working toward, it feels less like conflict and less like a rejection to the other party too, because oftentimes like we have that initial feeling of like, oh, that's not my job, I don't want to do this. And if we just respond that way, that could potentially create conflict, right? But when we shift it to like, well, what is the priority? What is it that I want to be accomplishing? What is important? What have we together, especially if we have this conversation at the outset around managing expectations, if we have this conversation around what the priority is and tying it back to that, it just makes it easier. It makes it less of a big issue.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah. And what would you not be able to do if you took on the extra work? Exactly.
Yep. Because something's got to give.
It's either me or
yeah.
Yeah. Well, and we had talked a little bit too, Anne, earlier around like, when do we set boundaries and when do we do this?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's really important to be thinking about this stuff as soon as possible. Like if you're starting a new job, I'll just give an example. Like my sister just started a new job as a graphic designer, and like a couple weeks in, they were like going to do an outside shoot, and they were like, hey, you know, we have too much to do, so we can't move this to next week, but we're going to do it this weekend. Can you come and join us like on the weekend? But like, you're not going to get overtime, but you know, if you want to be a part of the team, come do this. And she was like, I feel so conflicted because I'm new. And we talked about it as being really important actually to set that expectation up front of what are you actually willing to do. And if you're not willing to do that, that's okay, but set those expectations as early as possible. Because she's like, I don't want to give up my weekends, and I don't want to set that precedent going forward. So recognize like, what am I willing to give here? You know, and that's a big important part of this conversation too, and this reflection process is like, what am I willing to give? And then you can go back to that when you feel like you're being pulled in a direction you don't want to be going in.
Absolutely.
That makes sense. And then the other big part of setting boundaries is how people respond to you, which I don't have a slide on, but you know, it really spans the gamut. My perspective on this is that people who have good boundaries do a better job of hearing other people's boundaries than people who don't. So if they're willing to bend over backwards all the time and give everything to everyone and you say no to them, they're probably going to have more of an emotional reaction to that. But that's not about you. And I think that's an important thing to consider as well, is that you can't control how people see you. You can't control how people are going to respond to your boundaries. And that's why it's so important to have this time to reflect and think about, what is it that I want? What am I willing to give? What do I want to achieve? What is important to me? Because yeah, we can't necessarily always make other people see or understand that.
Yep. Well, do we want to open this up for a couple questions? It looks
Sure.
like Larry already put something in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Larry would like you to fix his problems for him. Love it.
I'm kind of here.
I'm ready to write down the answer or the suggestion. So please go right ahead. I'll appreciate it.
As a non-employee and understand their limits when controlling my work. Every time I exercise my rights, it turns into conflict.
Ugh.
Yes, that is a tough one. I mean, I think it's always tough to not be an intrinsic part of the culture, because it takes a lot of time and structure to build trust within an organization. And if that trust isn't there, like as you said, like conflict can come up easily because we don't trust that the other person has the right, they don't see us the way that we would like to be seen or see what our contributions are, and vice versa. So I'm curious about the phrase, every time I exercise my rights. I would ask you to explain that a little bit more.
For example, when working with one of our clients, my understanding of what controls a 1099 or establishes that status is that they can tell me what to do, but not get into the fine details of how to do it. And that's what they are trying to do. And I really should say an individual rather than they. Mm-hmm. And I can give you an example. The work that I do is preparing people for high stakes regulatory hearings. The kind of guidance or feedback or control that I get is, well, how are you placing the materials on the table when you're setting up the room? Or are you altering the agenda at all? Are you using the phrases that we prefer versus the ones that you tend to like when it comes to offering feedback to the folks that I'm dealing with? And this has really occurred just in the past year or two, where I'm just getting a lot of second guessing on my means and methods, even though the clients give me nothing but stellar feedback. It's I'll just say the leadership of the consulting firm that likes to come in and observe and then give me 3 or 4 pages of written feedback on what I've just done wrong. And it obviously does not set well with me. Every time I try to say, no, I'm not going to do it your way, I'll continue to keep the clients happy and bring in lots of revenue, but I'm not going to, I don't know, do the weird little particular things that you prefer when it comes to the logistics or the layout of the program. When I do that, I'm seen as, a traitor to the tradition or something. So like I say, it does turn to conflict. So yeah, I need a 30-second fix. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, what is at the root of control? Fear. Like, and in my experience, people like that who come in, they're afraid in some way, and they often need to feel important in some way.
Yeah.
And Greg have been to the workshop on feedback, which is the majority of feedback we give should be behavior reinforcing. He could use a lesson on that. But I think on your part, when you can recognize as like, like what's going on within this person, he's trying to control. How I would respond to it is I would say, like, I really appreciate your insight. Try to focus on the pieces of it that are helpful, and then kind of let the other pieces go. Because you're right. If you meet control with control, the wall is going to get bigger and harder, and it's going to turn into conflict. So if I were you, I would try to see the pieces of it that might be helpful, and then maybe even just hold within yourself. If you don't want to take this up, again, we only have 30 seconds. I would take it as like, thank you for this piece and this piece. Maybe I'll use those. And sometimes even just being heard a little bit can create a softening. Other times not.
All right. Well, as a footnote, the most recent time that I got, I'll just call it 3 pages of written feedback on a section of a session that I had just conducted for about an hour and a half or so. and one that I've done probably 200 times with good response from the clients. I was given those 3 pages of feedback. I still have not read them. I folded them up, put them in my notebook, and I couldn't begin to tell you where they are right now. I simply refuse to read them. So
Well, then the
that
other
helps
piece
me
of
with my
that,
own mental being.
yeah, and the other piece of it can be like, well, are you happy with my work? I mean, are you happy? Like the clients are happy. Here's the impact that it's having on the organization. Like this is how I'm going to do it. So, you know, how can we
Well,
move forward?
they keep scheduling me for sessions. I keep bringing in revenue for them and for myself. So that part of the equation works just fine.
Yeah.
If I decide, you know, I don't need that type of control in my life, I'm a little old for that, then I can live without the revenue. I'm not sure they can. So we'll see how that works out.
Yeah. And I think holding that and recognizing like when someone does that, knowing what the core of it is, can also maybe help you see it a little bit differently because it's not about you.
But you are exactly right. It is a matter of control and fear of losing that control that creates about 90% of the conflict that I'm getting into right now. And it's manifesting itself in the most minute, inconsequential, immaterial guidance that you could possibly imagine, rather than big picture. And the fact that, like I say, the clients themselves are very happy with me and continue to ask me to come back. So we'll see how it all sorts out.
And I would say if you wanted to put it into the framework of the nonviolent, if you wanted to give this person feedback, to say, when you do this and you only give me 3 pages of, you know, feedback about what I'm doing wrong.
That's the notes I have, is rather my approach, which doesn't seem to be working, is, okay, what you're doing, here's how it affects me. Here's what I would prefer. And we'll see if that works. It might.
Yeah. And see how that goes. And include in that, because especially when there is already a conflict that's been kind of building, I would, you know, fight your whatever you can within you to find a couple of things that he does well and that you do appreciate.
It's a she. It's a she, but
sorry, there I go. I would try to fight that a little bit and say, like, here's a few things that I do really appreciate about you and like what you bring.
Okay.
So.
I apologize for monopolizing the time. So I'm done. Thank you.
Specific examples are really helpful. So thank you.
Genny, do you have a final slide on how people can find you on the internet?
I do.
Oh,
so perfect. I have a series of new workshops beginning the week of June 13th. So I do have a relationship management one, which is the one that is specifically about giving and receiving feedback and how to approach conflict. And you can find me always on my Instagram at the EQ School. I post things every day. And then my website is theeqschool.co.
And the workshop on giving and receiving feedback that I went to was so freaking cool.
Thank you.
I love the positive feedback part too. We don't do that enough. So as we're thinking about the things that we are saying no to, I hope people take an opportunity today to remember what things you're saying yes to and get into your focus board and just update those cards. Remember what things you are prioritizing and what tasks you are working on right now. So Genny, thank you so much for joining us today. Larry made us a little no, perfect. And Sam, yes, the webinar is recorded. We have a YouTube channel where we've been putting the recorded webinars, and make sure you're following us on wherever you get your social media, if it's LinkedIn or Instagram or Facebook. Lovely to see you all. Thank you for joining us, Genny.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.